giving us some kind of introduction and overview why this topic that we discuss about today is so important. Robin, please.
Yeah, thank you, Jan Willem. So as Jan Willem said, we'll talk a little bit about why do we care and what's the bigger landscape for ground op sustainability. But maybe 4 key messages here we'll go through. I think one, sustainability is a key strategic concern right now for civil aviation. I think over the last years, we've seen these increase, and despite COVID-19, which is a horrible humanitarian crisis, it remains a top of mind topic in the industry. I think secondly, ground operations actually does matter, right? While we burn a lot more fuel in flight, there's still a significant amount burned on the ground, and we'll go a little bit in the details here. We do think there's a lot of inefficiencies. We work with quite a number of airlines and airports around the world to look at those and eliminate them, but it is quite obvious that there's still work to be done. And then lastly, what we're finding is that even though the levers of how to fix this are pretty well known, the getting it done actually requires a lot of teamwork and a number of other things that we'll talk about. So with that, let's jump into some of the details here. We've put together a few facts on the landscape of sustainability here. And if you're more interested in more details, we've recently published a white paper on the topic. You can find on our website. But to very quickly go through some of this, we've done a big consumer survey, and about 50% of customers are actually concerned about the CO2 emissions of their flights. We were quite surprised by that when we did the research. We thought it would be a lower number, and we also thought that geographically there would be much more of a difference than we saw. But even in geographies where you haven't seen as much public outcry, we see quite some concern amongst travelers. I think investors are also getting increasingly concerned. I mean, we see the inflows into ESG focused funds is significant, but even if you just look at earning calls and how much management teams discuss sustainability with analysts, we've seen a massive increase in that over the last year. And then lastly, governments are starting to step in, and travelers want governments to step in. And so if you just think about how some of the bailout packages in the COVID era have been structured, whether it's in Europe, where the stimulus in France, for example, includes a significant amount for hydrogen or potentially hydrogen-based aircraft, where we're stopping short-haul flights in favor of shifting it to rail. Or if you look at the US, where some of the early draft of the CARES Act included quite some sustainability measures for aviation, it is becoming clear that governments are having a keen eye on this. So then at the bottom here, just to go through a couple of things. Today, we're roughly at about 2.8% of total emissions coming from aviation, which you might say is not that much. But the problem here is aviation is still rapidly growing, and other modes have a much easier way to to get rid and abate carbon. And so what we're seeing happening is that unless we do a course correction in aviation, we'll see a 60% or so increase by 2050. When overall, of course, the goal is to go down, and that would really drive aviation's share into the high teens, right? So we would probably have more than 10% share of global emissions by the time cars go to battery and electric, and we go to solar for electricity in our homes and so on. And so it becomes an increasingly challenging problem. And then maybe just to mention, we've seen a good improvement in aviation over the last years, roughly 3.5% or so a year in reduction in emissions per passenger seat mile. But if you really peel back the onion on that, a lot of that actually comes from seat density and load factor, right? And so we've put more seats in the airplanes, and we've put more people in those seats. And that has really helped us with the emissions per seat kilometer. But there is a limit to this, right? Most of you would probably agree with me when I say in many airlines, we're not going to be able to add more seats, or hopefully we will not add more seats. And similarly, load factors were pretty high before COVID as well. And so that lever falls away. And so by that, our trajectory of improvement would really, really reduce. And so all of that to say is this is a problem that's here. It's a problem that's here to stay even in COVID. And it's a challenging problem for aviation to solve. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned earlier that ground operations really does matter, and let's look a little bit of what the breakdown is. And look, these numbers are illustrative for an A320 flight, about 500 miles. It changes a little bit if you go long range. Obviously, the ground portion would be smaller. If you take different aircraft type, it will change. But the numbers come out somewhere between 5 and 10% of the overall fuel burn here. So that comes down to taxi, it comes down to sitting at the gate, the APU usage, and then even some of the ground service equipment, right? We have a number of trucks, whether it's fuel trucks or baggage trucks. We have ground power units, air conditioning units. All of that really contributes to emissions. And so, 5 to 10% is a meaningful number here. That's why we need to focus on it. Next page, please. So to give you some examples of, where are we not efficient? And this obviously changes very much by which airport you're looking at and what time of day. But if you're in the industry, I'm sure you can relate to some of those examples here. But just to go through a couple of simple ones, right? How many times have we waited at the gate waiting for the ground crew to show up so that the plane can finally taxi in? It's something you see more in places where you need wing walkers and where you need ground crew to really bring the aircraft in. So for example, in North America, a little bit less in Europe, but it's still abundant across the world. And so, just a 3-minute hold will burn an extra 20 kilograms. Taxiing with all engines, for example, if there is unclear of what the taxi path looks like and how many turns you have to take, if you don't know if the ramp is really congested or not, whether you have to stop and go, pilots might choose to, use all engines to taxi in versus one. That easily adds another 25 kilograms just for the taxi in. Idle time of ground service equipment, right? Frequently we see, a truck or a catering truck or a fuel truck or so idling, waiting for an aircraft, or idling, just sitting around. Small numbers there, but they add up when you talk about thousands and thousands of flight operations, and so on. So the point to say here is lots of opportunity for us to spot waste in the system and eliminate it and become more efficient, and that helps the environment. So on the next page then, just to give us a bit of an overview of what levers are out there here. You see on the left-hand side just a list of a few of the levers. To be honest, we generally find with our clients that the levers are well known. People understand what you need to do. I think the question is really, how do you go about it and how do you make it sustainable? And what we found is there's 4 key things that as an industry we need to do more of, and quite frankly, it is hard, and we've not made as much progress as we should. I think the first one is intensify the cross-stakeholder collaboration, right? I mean, in a typical turnaround, you have somewhere between 7 to 12 or so different organizations involved, from ATC to the ramp managers, to the ground handler, to the caterers, to the fueling company, to the airline itself, where you have the flight attendants and the pilots and maybe load control. And so across those stakeholders, we need to increase data sharing, we need to increase collaborative decision-making, we need to increase really incentives to really align. And that is something that's not easy, especially not when you have commercial agreements between the parties. The second one here, and we see this strongly, is behavioral change. So a lot of these decisions that lead to waste are individual people making decisions. And they make them usually with very good intention, but they're often based on established behaviors that have been trained over many years, and it's hard to change that. And if you think about a pilot taxiing with 2 engines versus with 1, if you think about a ground equipment operator that lets the engine idle, if you think about the usage of APU on the ground, a lot of these things come back down to individual behavior and how people are empowered to make decisions. And so training, mindset shift, etc., is very important, we see, to really get this number right. The next one here, advanced analytics. We see there is a huge opportunity to really use data and analytics to better understand where are the problems. We've worked with a number of airlines on things like analyzing ground operations of APU to just spot what are the hot spots where waste happens, what are kind of the mitigation efforts we can put in. There is a ton of data coming off aircraft today. And as an industry, we're just not making enough use of that. And then solutions like Asaya or some of the other airport systems, add an incredible amount of data to that. And we as an industry just need to find better ways to leverage that. And then lastly, and this is one that is probably on everybody's mind, but rollout of new technologies. I think especially in the ground operations side, and we'll hear from our friends at Schiphol in a moment, opportunities to use ground-based vehicles for taxiing. There's opportunities to use electric or hydrogen or some kind of hybrid ground service equipment. There is ways to use technology to optimize taxi routes. There's ways to use different kind of concrete. And so there's a number of technologies coming out that as we're building infrastructure and renewing it, we should think about how do we build it in a way that is more sustainable. So I think that hopefully gave us a good overview of why do we care about this. It is a big topic, and ground operations is a big piece of it. And why it is hard, which is, we have a number of points where waste happens, and, we need to work together and need to focus on leveraging data better and really changing our behavior. So with that, let's look at the example from our friends at Schiphol.